Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be on the call, and thank you very much for sparing some of your time to join us. The subject of today's webinar is very much around the opportunities and challenges of running international assessment processes. And as part of this, Jouko and myself are going to be talking about some of the differences that occur when working across business cultures around the world, and some of the stereotypes associated with each of these. So really just to get you warmed up or to get you in the zone, we thought it would be fun to share some extracts from a session that we ran at our last Global Employee Conference. This was a session covering some of the cultural do's and don'ts across the different countries in which Cubics operates. So we will start with the UK, and this was a slide that we shared about some of the cultural do's. I guess the key thing here is the British are really renowned for being not particularly clear or direct in what they're saying, and that's illustrated by this example above. Other examples of our roundabout or indirect way of communicating include sayings like, "I hear what you say," which is sort of code, or I guess sort of the English way of saying, "I really don't agree with you and don't want to discuss this any further." Another example is, "Could we consider some other options?" which again is a very sort of indirect way of saying, "I really don't like your idea." So some of the do's in working with British are about being less direct and a little bit circumspect. In terms of the don'ts, just waiting for the slide to change. Kissing. Ugh. The British, we don't do it once, we don't do it twice, or we don't even do it 3 times. We just want to shake hands. You know, when we are comfortable with kissing colleagues or business contacts, which I have to say is not very often, we have no idea of how many times we should kiss, which side, when, which order. It's all a complete mystery to us. So I'm going to hand you over to Jouko, who's going to talk a little bit about some Dutch stereotypes.
Hello everybody, good morning, afternoon, evening, night, etc. Glad to be here, very nice. Some Dutch examples. This is a typical Dutch example of what we do not like. Yes, we do have managers like in most countries, but we do not like to please our managers. So managers, bosses, be aware not to boss your Dutch employees too much. Normally when our boss is asking us a question, we say yes, but, and then there comes a whole story why you don't agree. So this is generally seen as typical Dutch. Another thing that we are famous for is that, in contradiction to what David just mentioned about the English preferences, we prefer to be open and direct. These are 2 colleagues of mine. This, of course, was a fictional picture, but this is something that would happen in the office every day. We lack some sensitivity, and we prefer to say it like it is. And we also see that if you look at politics, for instance, in the European Union, we're not really good at sensitive things, politics. We do not play the game. We do not prefer to have hidden agendas. So if you work with the Dutch people, yes, I think they are nice people, but forgive them of being a little bit blunt.
So you can only imagine the fun and games that Jouko and I had pulling this webinar together. He thought I was vague and not terribly clear, and I thought he was abrupt and rather direct with some of his feedback and comments. But no, more seriously, jumping on to the actual webinar itself, really 3 broad areas that Jouko and I are going to talk about this afternoon. So the first one is really a little bit of positioning and sharing with you and telling you a little bit in our experience why it is that organizations run international assessment projects. We're then going to move on and talk about some of the key challenges in doing this kind of thing successfully and smoothly. And then we're going to conclude with really some advice and some hints and tips on how you might actually approach this kind of thing yourselves. So I guess that's the backdrop. In terms of why organizations run international leadership assessment and development processes, I guess a lot of it is around a desire at a global level to bring more consistency, and that's broadly to their talent management processes, also to hiring and promotion decisions. We also get involved in projects that support broader leadership development, conducting management audits that assist in cross-cultural, cross-country mergers and acquisitions and their subsequent integration, and to support changes in strategic direction or new ambition. So why do organizations do this? What do they get in return? And I guess really some of the key stuff is really great data. So really great data that will help them give them on a real handle and understanding on where their talent sits, not just nationally but regionally and also potentially internationally. They'll get objective and fair data that will help them make better quality decisions about who to promote, who to put into a talent pool, who to include in a succession plan, and a much better forward look in terms of capability and future potential. So I guess those are some of the typical organizational outputs and the value that they get. Individuals coming through this process or these processes typically end up with great insights about themselves, really high quality data to support them with their development, a much clearer understanding of what the organization wants and expects from its leaders, and I guess these in turn lead to better engagement and retention amongst the leaders taking part in these processes. So how do we know all of this? Well, I guess really some high-level data. In the last 12 months, Cubics have delivered over 3,500 face-to-face assessments globally, and in addition over 1.5 million online assessments. And just you'll see appearing on the map some of the locations where we've both got operations where we've delivered assessments, partners, and also other countries and locations that we've engaged consultants or flown into ourselves. So we really do cover off most of the world. So I guess all of this sounds very sensible. We hopefully all reasonably clear now why organizations are assessing internationally and some of the benefits and the data that they get from this. So it's all very sensible and straightforward. So what are the challenges? So I'm going to hand over to Jouko, who's going to begin the process of talking about some of the key challenges.
Thank you, David. The first challenge we would like to focus on is working with global leadership frameworks. So in general, a lot of companies, a lot of clients of ours have this one approach. If you talk about this is essential if you want to be effective as a leader in our company, especially if you move upwards, so the more senior people, then you get this one global framework that is designed really well, sometimes at least really well, with all clear behavioral indicators, and this is what you should do as a leader within our company. What you also see is that in these frameworks, we work for a lot of international clients, so based in different countries, different regions of the world. These frameworks somehow reflect also the countries where headquarters is based in. So you can see that in a Swedish company, this framework is different than if it's a Japanese company or an Israeli company. What you not always see is that these frameworks take into account what is needed to be effective across the globe. They often have one view on what is a high potential, for instance. They have one view on what is it to be effective as a leader. A good way of looking at these cultural differences, I see the next slide already here, is a model of Hofstede. Not sure, because I haven't checked the whole audience, but this is a typically accepted way of looking at cultural differences. You see at the top power distance that there's a lot to do with do people feel comfortable with difference in hierarchy? Do they have a lot of respect for authority? Two countries that are on the opposite, for instance, is on one hand Russia, the other hand New Zealand. I think with all these cultural differences, I will explain a few others. It's important if you do assessments on an international basis to think how will these cultural differences of these cultures, how will that impact an assessment? So the assessment, how will it impact the way you interact with each other, the methodology you use, etc., etc. Another one that's really interesting, I find normally, is, for instance, the long-term orientation. It has a lot to do with where is your focus on? Is it on short-term gain or more on the long-term strategy, for instance? You see here at one hand countries like China, a really long-term focus. On the other hand countries, for instance, like Pakistan. There's a lot more focus on the short-term gain. In general, I think the most important message if we talk about cultural differences is that it's not a matter of good or bad. It's just a matter of it's different. So when you approach people, when you approach a project that has an assessment project that is rolled out globally, you have to be aware of all these cultures are pulled into the process. Okay, can we put on the next one? Taking all these cultural differences into account, we also see that there are a lot of things we normally assess that could be explained real differently. So this is important if you think about the design of a competence framework, but it's also important if you think of how do assessors assess. We have a few examples here. In some countries and some cultures, being direct and outspoken would be really great. In other countries, there's more an emphasis on being careful and considerate. In the countries where they're not so, where they don't have a big focus or not so much appreciate the direct and outspoken behaviors, they could consider those people, like sometimes the Dutch, as being too direct and inconsiderate. And so you see here a few nice examples and also the opposite. So for instance, in a lot of countries, mainly Western countries, for instance, or the US is a good example, people are really ambitious and eager, could be perceived as being self-centered and arrogant. And I'm not saying, I think that's also an important message, that they are arrogant, but it could be perceived as being arrogant from the perspective of another culture. There are also countries and cultures where there's a big focus on being open and consulting others. Thinking about the Hofstede model, for instance, it could be the feminine cultures versus the masculine. For instance, in Europe, in the northern of Europe, by origin, people are, the cultures could be described as more feminine, so asking more questions, not taking all the decisions yourself, doing things together. Could be also being perceived from another perspective as you don't know what you're talking about. You always need to have the advice of someone else. I think this explains it on a high level. If we move on to the next slide, you can see here that if you talk about leadership across the globe, because we now briefly tapped into some aspects like the cultural differences and how things could be explained differently, there has been a lot of research on what do companies assess worldwide. We've listed here more or less, I think it's a top 10. I've checked it beyond, but this is the top 10 of the competencies that are assessed most looking across the globe. There are differences here if you think about regional differences. For instance, I was surprised by that, but you can explain it. Planning and organizing, there was one region where this was assessed less than in the other regions, and that was the Asian region. An explanation there could be that not in all Asian countries, but in a lot of Asian countries, there's more focus on this uncertainty avoidance, and there's a lower need for structure, so to plan ahead could be a real good explanation. Again, thinking about having one framework or multiple frameworks, is it realistic to have one framework? I think that's one of the most important questions if we focus on doing assessment internationally. Leadership, this is effective leadership. This comes out of a big research project from Globe. Not sure if people know that, but the Globe Leadership and Organizational Behavior is a research that has started in the early 90s, where approximately 65 cultures gave input to. You see that there is some consistency if you think about what is effective in the UK, what is effective in Thailand or in Africa or in Brazil, but there are also some differences. What is universally seen as an effective leadership style is the charismatic and the value-based leadership, so someone who has a big presence, someone who can overwhelm other people, who can create enthusiasm, and someone who has a real driver from within, strong values, strong personal opinions, and who also is focused on bringing them across. You can also see that there are leadership styles that are not so effective everywhere. There's the participative leadership, for instance. I talked about the Nordics, but also the Netherlands. So the leadership style where you ask a lot of people, a lot of input, and you give a lot of decision-making power to the team. It's not seen as effective in all cultures. So some highlight, how do you see leadership across the globe? What's effective here? Does it have to be effective somewhere else? So some final examples on how single unified frameworks can fail. A term that we often see, for instance, decision making, something that we always, most of the times, have to assess if you talk about global leadership frameworks. Is decision making focused on analysis and objectivity, or is it more focused on these personal connections? How do you take these decisions together? Could be a whole difference. So the decision-making process isn't the same in every country or in every culture. Impact, another one that is really sensitive for cultural differences. In a lot of countries, not in all, but in a lot of countries, for instance in the Netherlands, it's important to look someone in the eye if you meet each other. If you have a conversation, it's seen as impolite if you look the other way. I've also worked in a lot of countries where it's totally the opposite. You look people in the eye. You don't look people in the eye. It's a lack of respect. Results focus. Also a typical term, typical competence that you use in a lot of assessments could have to do with being really eager and getting things done right away. At the same time, there are situations, but especially cultures, where it's more focused. If you talk about results, you have a more long-term focus. So you don't have to do it right away. You have to have this objective. You have to look at the future and build step by step towards the end. So I think there are a lot of challenges we briefly tapped on. It's not so straightforward. I think that's the biggest and the most important conclusion. Hopefully, we'll discuss that later on, it starts to get easier on the way. Now we have seen all those cultural differences, but I think I can warn you already, it's not so easy. Even taking all this knowledge and experience around what is different and what is effective across the globe, how do you then design a good assessment approach? And I think I will hand over here to David.
Okay, so we've heard that a number of challenges in terms of defining what we're going to assess, some of the complexities around differences in leadership and how leadership manifests itself around the world, and how that can or should be captured in a single or multiple leadership frameworks. So what about the different assessment tools and methods that we have at our disposal? On the screen now you can see a word cloud just showing some of the more common and regularly used assessment tools. I'm sure many of you will have had experience of a number of these. Key challenge though, I guess, with these, from my point of view, it's mainly to do with language. And a lot of assessment tools and a lot of assessment processes are delivered in English, and in turn make unreasonable expectations about candidates' ability to operate in English. I guess really our stance on this is, whilst there's justification for leaders to be able to operate in a common business language, most processes fail because they don't really make enough accommodation for the fact that some candidates are having to work in their second, or recently I came across an example of a candidate having to work in his third language. So, you know, it's almost a tendency to take a UK or a US process and just impose it on the rest of the world. So really common challenges when it comes to language are around the complexity of vocabulary, use of local names, and I guess also the amount of time pressure. You know, those of us that have been involved in assessment processes will know that we try to squeeze as much as we can into a day-long assessment or a half-day assessment, and what this results in is quite a lot of time pressure, which when you're having to read, assimilate, understand information in a language that's not your native language is going to take longer. A second challenge is around poor choice and poor practice in using psychometric tools. So by psychometric tools, I mean personality questionnaires and ability tests. There are literally thousands of personality questionnaires out there on the market. A number of them were built for use in a particular context or a particular business culture, and only a small number of these are available and were built specifically to be used culturally. Another common challenge is getting someone to complete a personality questionnaire in their non-native language. Again, it goes back to this point around vocabulary. Some of the subtleties in language and meaning in personality questionnaires are really, really subtle and slight. And so a lot of the predictive power and value from a personality questionnaire can be lost if someone doesn't really understand all the words that they're being expected to respond to. Ability tests, again, a further source of challenge. Common problems there are, again, getting people to do an ability test in typically English or certainly not their native language. And again, ability tests are almost universally what we call speeded, where people have a large number of questions to complete and not very much time. And so I'm sure you get the point that, with time pressure, working in your non-native language, you're going to find it more difficult than a native speaker. Often there are shortcomings as well in the norms, so the comparison or the reference groups that are used to judge and evaluate the scores from international samples. And I guess the third sort of issue around assessment tools is more to do with familiarity and usage of certain types of tool around the world. I think probably the most common example is, a lot of European and American assessment processes include simulations. What do we mean by simulations? Business case studies, role plays, group meetings. So whilst these are fairly well known and well understood and to an extent expected in those territories, that's certainly the case, less the case elsewhere. We've recently been doing some work in South Africa. Whilst the use of simulations is made use of some of the time, it is much less than is the case in Europe and America. So again, I think we have to just remember all the time here that what works well in certain countries isn't necessarily going to be known, understood, or familiar in other territories as well.
Yeah, David, if I may interrupt, there's one. The other thing is also true that if you think about the use of psychometric tools, what seems real close by for me is Italy, for instance. But I recently had a big discussion with one of our partners in Italy, and they say, okay, we don't do psychometric tests. We just have the conversation. Sometimes we do role plays, we do interviews, but we're not a big fan of tests. It's not in the veins of the Italian culture. So you can be surprised sometimes as well.
Yeah, no, it goes on, doesn't it, Jouko? And it's not just things like that. It's also things like just even how we conduct and organize an assessment. So a lot of us will be familiar with an event that's laid out in some detail with a fairly rigid timescale and timetable, and very different attitudes from participants as you move around the world. I was working with an organization recently that has strong roots in France, and just getting people to stick to time and avoid interruptions and phone calls was much more challenging than with a UK-based group.
Yeah, that's more accepted, true.
So very, very different attitudes to all aspects of assessment. So, gosh, we've presented you with some quite meaty challenges. Presumably there can't be any more, can there? Well, I'm afraid yes. So hand back to Jouko.
So then I think we discussed now a little bit about what we assess. We started there and these cultural differences, and David now dipped into the tools and the methodology that we use and how that can impact an international process. One of the other things that's crucial for, at least if you talk about the life assessment processes, because in our field of expertise, in our business, I think you have two different angles. Sometimes if you talk about assessments, it's purely the online part, so doing the questionnaires, doing the tests, sometimes each-way or 360 feedback questionnaires. That's a part. The other part is where we have actually live meetings with participants or with candidates. So then you come across the assessor. So who is doing the assessment? Looking at who is doing the assessment, that is the assessment, the core of assessment centers as we know them these days. So how do you ensure that all these assessors rate or evaluate the behavior and the performance of all these candidates and participants in the same way? thinking about all these assessors are individuals, and yes, you can give them a good assessor training. Yes, they can work in the same company, they can work together for ages and for years, but still you see that each assessor sometimes has different rating behaviors. So you have these assessors who have the tendency to focus more on the middle of the scale. You have these assessors who are a little bit more mild or more extreme in the way they rate people. A lot of these things have to do with frames of reference. In technical term, it has to do with what has created your reference. Normally that is based upon your values, the things you get when you are born and raised within your family, your school, the society that you're in. You get an idea about what is good, what's effective, what's ineffective. This is in some way disturbing your objective assessment process. If you roll out international projects, it is really important that assessors are really aware of their own tendencies and that you train them and give them the right tools and methodologies to come over these pitfalls. And next, if you even take into account, so there are a lot of differences between individuals already. There are also a lot of differences between regions. For instance, I worked in a project that we rolled out in Europe, South America, and the United States, and for me it was interesting to see. It was a development center, so it was purely focused on development. It was not focused on selecting people, but in the US, on an average, people got higher ratings. Could mean that the people in the US just showed better behaviors and higher performance, but the groups were pretty big, so that would be really that would be an exception. In the end, we had a big discussion with the assessors, an assessor discussion. We do that with all people or assessors that are involved from the different regions. We have these assessors meetings to share how you assess people, and we discuss on the differences in how you use your rating skills. These American assessors that were involved were really on the track of being extremely positive. Yes, people can develop a lot of things. Yes, if you really work hard, put a lot of effort in it, I believe that you can grow. This influence in how positive they were in their ratings, especially talking about potential. Because that was another big objective of these assessments. Yes, we focus on development of people, but also what kind of potential do they have? How far can they grow? What can they do to move upwards one level or two levels? So this positive mindset of the assessors in a way influence the way they assess, especially the potential of the participants. This is about the assessor as such, and then we haven't even tapped into the interaction between assessor and candidates. So what do you do as an assessor or as a candidate when you are confronted with someone from a different culture or a different background? This is something that has to do with experience. You have to be trained in this. I think you have to be exposed to this cultural difference to be a really good assessor in an international context. So I think assessing in an international context is really a different level of assessing locally. So it's all a bit of a minefield. What to do? Is there a solution? I think what we did now is we created a lot of possible difficulties, and yes, I think we can tackle most of them. So let me try to summarize or put it together what we've been discussing so far. I think the main conclusion is that it's not easy. It's far from straightforward. And if you are in the beginning of the design of an assessment process or project, so let's say you're working within an international company on a headquarter, and your assignment or your objective is to create some consistency on how you hire or recruit people on a senior level. That's where you start, okay? How do you start and as rolling this process out? I think it's key. What is the objective of this whole process? Is it local, regional, global decision making? Is it assessment? Is it focused on development? So what is driving this need? Is it to support all the countries that all the operational companies that belong to the same group in doing good assessments? Or is there also a need of being involved from headquarters? David and I discussed around this, and it was interesting. You could see that sort of a dimension. That in one hand, you have the imperialistic view. So this is These are companies or cultures who approach the world with their approach on how an assessment should be done. At the other end, you have the real autonomous pole of the dimension, so where you leave a lot of decision making, but also on the process itself to the local companies. And of course, often it's a mixture, so then you get federalist. If you look at research in general, how companies have been running, I think American companies, UK companies, and Japanese companies are good examples of this more imperialistic view. And I keep on reminding myself, but this is with all respect for all cultures and all differences. And I think, for instance, the Dutch would be more in the federalist area. So you can think about all examples for all these other parts, places on the dimension. Last but not least, I think it's really important to think about, okay, even if we leave a lot of freedom and decision-making power to countries or to regions, how do you compare? Because it is a question that's always in there. How do you calibrate? How do you calibrate and compare what you've done in Australia and what you've done in India? I think this is one of the key questions, and we will answer that later on in the webinar. So to sum up, I think David mentioned something about language, crucial. Also crucial to have assessors who, we will talk about it later on, to have assessors who have experience with interviewing and doing role play with non-native speakers sometimes. Because then the set of words you use are different. A lot of things to think about, but as said, it's a minefield. What to do, how to move forward. Thanks everybody for listening. Enjoy the day or the evening.